Imagine a time when the world held its breath, when the sky turned the color of iron and the rhythm of life slowed to the beating of a single heart. Outside, the cold is a wolf scratching at the door, but inside is a fortress of small comforts. Let's step back into the dark, quiet safety of a medieval winter and let the world fade away. The sky turned the color of iron, and the wind began to whisper against the daub and wattle walls, signaling the start of the long wait, the time when the world seemed to hold its breath and the rhythm of life slowed to the beating of a single heart. It was the season of the distinct and heavy cold that pressed against the shutters, asking to be let in. But the medieval house was a fortress of small comforts, a place where the fire was the sun and the hearth was the center of the universe. The peasant would wake before the light, though in winter the light was a reluctant guest, arriving late and leaving early, casting long shadows that stretched across the earthen floor like fingers of the night holding on. He would stir the embers of the fire, the ash gray and soft, finding the glowing red heart beneath the white dust, and he would feed it with a piece of dried turf or a carefully saved log, watching the smoke rise in a thin, straight line up toward the vent in the roof where the cold air waited. The house was quiet, filled with the breathing of the family and the occasional rustle of the straw in the mattresses, a sound that was as familiar as the wind outside. There was no hurry in these movements, for winter was a time of enforced patience, a time when the fields lay fallow and hard as stone under a blanket of frost that sparkled in the pale moonlight. The work was done, the harvest was gathered, and now the task was simply to endure, to make the stores last, to count the sacks of grain and the barrels of salted meat with a careful, meticulous eye. He would walk to the corner of the room where the wooden chest stood, its iron hinges cold to the touch, and check the latch, ensuring that the precious flour was safe from the mice that sought warmth just as the humans did. The smell of the room was a mixture of wood smoke and dried herbs, of woolen blankets and old stone, a scent that was ancient and comforting, telling a story of survival that had been repeated for 100 generations. Outside, the snow might be falling, a silent accumulation of white that softened the edges of the world, turning the sharp lines of the fences and the roofs into gentle curves, erasing the paths and the roads until the village was an island in a sea of white. The animals in the byre, the oxen and the few precious cows, would be shifting their weight, their breath misting in the cold air, their warmth contributing to the heat of the house, a symbiotic sharing of life against the freeze. The peasant would attend to them, checking their water, which had to be broken of ice, and offering them the hay that had been cut in the sun of July, a memory of summer preserved in dry stalks. The routine was hypnotic, a circle of small tasks that filled the hours between the darkness and the darkness. He would check the walls for drafts, running his hand over the rough plaster, feeling for the telltale stream of cold air that meant a crack needed to be filled with moss or mud. He would sit by the fire and mend a tool, the rhythmic scraping of a knife against wood the only sound in the room, a sound that was dull and repetitive and deeply soothing. The wood was ash or oak, hard and seasoned, and the shavings would curl onto the floor to be swept into the fire later. The women of the house would be spinning wool, the drop spindle twirling in a slow, steady motion, the fibers being pulled and twisted into yarn that would become the cloth that kept them alive. The sound of the spindle was a low hum, a vibration in the air that seemed to harmonize with the crackle of the fire. They would sort the dried beans, picking them over one by one, their fingers moving with practiced ease, separating the good from the bad, a task that required no thought, only a quiet presence.
The light in the room would change imperceptibly as the day wore on, shifting from the gray of dawn to the pale yellow of noon and back to the gray of twilight, the sun never rising high enough to truly warm the earth. They would eat a pottage made of peas and oats, a thick, warm mixture that filled the belly and spread heat through the limbs, eating it slowly from wooden bowls with wooden spoons, savoring the warmth more than the flavor. The steam would rise from the bowls and disappear into the rafters, joining the smoke. There was a sense of suspension, as if time itself had frozen along with the river, the water beneath the ice moving slowly, dark and sluggish. The villagers would rarely venture far, perhaps only to the woodpile or the well, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their breath trailing behind them like white ribbons. They would nod to a neighbor if they saw one, a silent acknowledgment of the shared endurement, but words were scarce, for to speak was to let in the cold. Inside, the air was still and heavy. The family would gather closer to the fire as the evening approached, the circle tightening as the temperature dropped. They would tell stories, not new ones, but old ones, stories they had heard 1,000 times before, about the saints or the ancestors or the trickster fox, the words flowing over them like a warm blanket. The voice of the storyteller would be low and monotonous, a drone that lulled the listeners into a state of half-sleep. They would watch the flames dance, seeing shapes in the fire, castles and dragons and faces of people long gone. The logs would break apart with a soft thud, sending up a shower of sparks that drifted upward like reversed snow. The dog would sigh in its sleep, twitching its paws as it dreamed of rabbits in the summer fields. The cat would be a ball of fur near the hearth, purring with a vibration that could be felt through the floor. The darkness would press against the windows, absolute and total, a darkness that swallowed the world, leaving only this small sphere of light and heat. They would prepare for sleep early, for there was little reason to stay awake when the candles were precious and the cold was waiting. They would bank the fire, covering the coals with ash to keep them alive until morning, a ritual of preservation that was essential for survival. They would lay out the pallets and the skins, piling on every available blanket, creating a nest of warmth. The transition from the day to the night was seamless, a fading of activity into stillness. As they lay in the dark, they would listen to the house settling, the timber groaning as it contracted in the cold, the wind whistling through the eaves, a lullaby of winter. The silence was not empty, but full of the presence of the season, a heavy, muffling weight that pressed down on the eyelids. They would think of the seeds sleeping in the frozen earth, waiting for the spring that seemed an eternity away, yet was inevitable. They would think of the stores in the pantry, calculating again in their minds, assuring themselves that there was enough, that they would last. The medieval winter was a test of endurance, but it was also a time of rest, a time when the body and the mind could slow down, released from the frantic labor of the harvest. It was a hibernation, a long sleep that restored the soul. The breathing in the room would deepen, becoming a collective rhythm, a slow in and out that matched the swaying of the bare trees outside. The cold was a wolf scratching at the door, but the door was barred and the fire was warm. In the depths of the night, the silence would be absolute, the wind having died down, leaving the world suspended in a crystal clarity of frost. The stars would be hard and bright points of light in the black sky, watching over the sleeping village. The moon would cast a blue light on the snow, creating shadows that were sharp and black. Inside the house, the warmth would linger, trapped in the thick walls and the thatch. The dreams would be slow and disjointed, fragments of summer days and green fields, of warm sun and flowing water. The cycle would continue, day after day, a repetition of fire and food and sleep, a slow march through the months of ice. They would mend the nets and sharpen the scythes, preparing for a future that felt distant. They would check the salted pork, turning the meat to ensure it cured evenly. They would grind the grain in a small hand mill, the stone grinding against stone with a rasping sound that filled the quiet afternoon. The dust of the flour would settle on their hands and clothes, a fine white powder that smelled of life. They would melt snow for water, watching the white clumps dissolve into clear liquid in the iron pot. They would sew patches onto worn tunics, the needle passing through the thick wool with a soft resistance. Every action was deliberate, every movement calculated to conserve energy. The winter was a besieging army, but they were the patient defenders, holding out with the weapons of patience and routine. The days were short, mere interruptions in the long night.
The sun would skirt the horizon, a pale disk without heat, touching the tops of the trees before sinking back into the earth. The twilight was long and blue, a time of indeterminate light when the world lost its color and became a study in gray and white. The birds were gone, save for the crows and the ravens that sat like black sentinels on the bare branches, their calls harsh and jarring in the silence. The squirrels were sleeping in their drays, the bears in their dens, the frogs in the mud at the bottom of the pond. All of nature was asleep, and the humans were part of that great slumber. The smoke from the village chimneys rose straight up, pillars of gray connecting the earth to the sky. The village was a cluster of warmth in a cold universe. The church bell would ring, a lonely sound that carried for miles in the thin air, marking the hours of prayer, the only structure in a day that had lost its shape. The monk in his cell would be writing, his hand cold, the ink thickening in the pot, his breath misting as he illuminated a letter, a small act of devotion in the freezing dark. The lord in his castle would be sitting by a great fire, wrapped in furs, playing chess or listening to a song, but even he felt the cold, the draught that sneaked under the tapestry, the chill that rose from the stone floor. The winter was the great leveler, treating the peasant and the king with the same icy indifference. The focus was on the immediate, on the sensation of warmth on the skin, on the taste of the hot broth, on the softness of the wool. There was no planning for the distant future, only the management of the present. The mind would wander, drifting like the snow, touching on small memories and then moving on. The dampness of the thaw was months away. For now, there was only the dry, biting cold. The woodpile would shrink slowly, a visual measure of the passing of time. The stack of hay in the barn would lower. These were the clocks of winter. The family would huddle together, sharing body heat, a tangled mass of limbs and blankets. The sleep was deep and dreamless, a retreat from the harsh reality of the frozen world. When they woke, it would be to the same gray light, the same cold air, the same routine. And in this repetition, there was a strange kind of peace, a freedom from choice, a surrender to the season. The world was simplified, reduced to the basics of heat and food. The complexities of summer, the disputes and the bargains were forgotten, buried under the snow. There was only the fire, the wall, and the weight. The texture of the woolen blanket against the cheek was rough and scratchy, but it held the warmth. The smell of the roasting onion in the ashes was sharp and sweet. The sound of the wind was a constant companion, a voice that never ceased. They would watch the icicles grow on the eaves, long daggers of ice that caught the weak light. They would break them off to melt for water or to suck on for a moment of cold shock. The path to the privy was a trench cut in the snow, a tunnel of white walls. The air was so cold it felt solid in the lungs. To breathe was to taste the frost. The hands would become chapped and red, the skin cracking in the dry air. They would rub them with tallow or goose grease, a simple remedy that offered some relief.
The routine was a lifeline, a rope to hold on to in the storm. They would comb the wool, carding it into fluffy clouds ready for spinning. They would weave baskets from dried willow, the rods bending and snapping into place. They would carve wooden spoons and bowls, the knife slicing through the grain. The shavings would accumulate, a soft carpet on the floor. The mind would settle into a trance, focused only on the movement of the hands. The worries of the world would fade away. The fear of the harvest failing, the fear of sickness, the fear of war, all were suspended. There was only the winter, the endless, silent, white winter. The fire would crackle, a sudden burst of sound that emphasized the quiet. A log would roll over, a coal would pop. The rhythm of the house was the rhythm of the earth, slow, steady, unyielding. The darkness was not frightening, but protective. It hid the world and its dangers. It wrapped the house in a cocoon of safety. The sleep was a heavy curtain that fell and rose, separating the periods of waking. The waking was a time of small movement. The sleeping was a time of stillness. The boundary between the two was blurred. One could doze by the fire, the head nodding, the tool slipping from the hand. One could wake in the night and listen to the wind, then drift back into slumber. The state of being was one of preservation, storing energy, keeping warm, waiting. The heart beat slower, the breath was shallower, the thoughts were fewer. The medieval winter was a pause in the sentence of life, a comma, a breath. And in that pause there was a profound boredom that was almost a meditation, a stripping away of the unnecessary, a return to the essential. The grain in the bin, the wood on the fire, the roof over the head, the family close by. That was all that mattered. The rest was just wind and snow. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The snow piled higher, the ice grew tighter, and still the life inside the house went on, quietly, slowly, surely. The embers glowed, the wheel turned, the breath misted, the heart beat, and the winter held them all in its cold, white hand, protecting them from the chaos of the world with a blanket of boredom and sleep. The feeling of the heavy quilt, the sound of the slow breath, the sight of the dying ember, the smell of the wood smoke, the taste of the oats, the touch of the rough wood, the sensation of the warmth, the absence of urgency, the presence of peace, the long, long wait, the endless gray sky, the silence of the snow, the comfort of the routine, the safety of the boredom, the heaviness of the eyelids, the slow drift into the dark, the quiet, the still, the sleep. The fire burned low, the room grew cooler, the breathing deepened, the dreams began, and the medieval life, wrapped in its winter coat, slept on, waiting for the sun that would eventually, inevitably, return. But not yet, not now. Now was for sleeping. Now was for the quiet. Now was for the dark.
The days stretched into a seamless ribbon of gray light and long shadows, the sun a distant memory that visited only briefly to mock the frozen earth before retreating behind the veil of clouds. The thatch of the roof was now buried under a foot of snow, a white, heavy blanket that insulated the house but also weighed upon the timbers, causing them to groan in the deep silence of the night. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of peat and unwashed wool, a scent of hibernation that clung to the skin and the hair. The family moved with the slow deliberation of sleepwalkers, conserving every ounce of energy, their movements small and contained within the circle of the firelight. They would check the apples stored in the straw, turning each one to ensure the rot had not set in, the skin of the fruit cool and waxy under their fingertips. A single bad apple could spoil the rest, so the task was done with a grave seriousness, a ritual of preservation that required no words, only the steady rhythm of lifting and turning. The root vegetables in the clamp outside were buried deep in the earth, protected by layers of straw and soil, and fetching them was an expedition into the Arctic air, a breathless dash to retrieve the turnips and the carrots before the cold could seep into the bones. The ground was hard as iron, ringing under the strike of the spade, resisting every effort to disturb its slumber. Back inside, the warmth was a physical embrace, a wall of heat that hit the face and stung the frozen cheeks. They would peel the vegetables, the knife paring away the dirt and the skin in long, continuous strips, the sound of the blade against the crisp flesh a sharp note in the quiet room. The peelings were saved for the pig. Nothing was wasted, for waste was a sin against survival. The soup would simmer for hours, the bubbles rising slowly to the surface and bursting with a soft plop, releasing the aroma of earth and sustenance. They would dip the hard, stale bread into the broth, softening it until it could be eaten, the warm liquid filling the stomach and bringing a heavy drowsiness. The old grandmother would sit in the corner, her hands gnarled like the roots of an oak, knitting without looking, her needles clicking a soft rhythm that measured out the passing of the hours. She was making socks, thick and shapeless things of gray wool that would keep the frostbite at bay, her mind traveling back to winters past, to faces long gone, while her hands continued their work in the present. The children would play quietly with dolls made of straw or bits of wood, their voices hushed, their energy dampened by the oppressive weight of the season. There was no running, no shouting, only the small, contained games of the fireside. The dog would lift its head at a sound outside, a branch snapping under the weight of the snow, or the cry of a desperate fox, its ears twitching before it settled back down, chin on paws, sighing deeply. The fire was the clock, the calendar, and the sun. They watched it consume the wood, the logs turning from brown to black to gray ash, the heat radiating out and fading, a cycle that repeated endlessly. To fetch more wood was a chore that was dreaded, the pile outside covered in snow, the logs frozen together, requiring force to separate them. The wood was cold and damp, sizzling as it hit the fire, sending up small jets of steam before catching alight. The smoke would sting the eyes, a constant irritant that was accepted as the price of warmth. They would rub their eyes and cough, a dry hacking sound that echoed in the rafters. The light from the single tallow candle was yellow and flickering, casting long dancing shadows on the walls, shapes that seemed to move and breathe. The candle was a luxury, burned only when necessary, its smell acrid and fatty. Mostly they lived in the twilight of the fire, a dim world where vision was limited to the immediate vicinity. They would mend the tools, wrapping the handles with leather strips to give a better grip, sharpening the blades with a whetstone, the rhythmic rasping a sound that was hypnotic. The metal was cold and dull, reflecting the firelight in muted glints. They would check the grain sacks again, running the grain through their fingers, a golden stream of life that had to last until the harvest, months away. The fear of the bottom of the sack was a constant low-level anxiety that lived in the back of the mind, a shadow that never quite disappeared. But for now, the sack was full enough, and the anxiety was just a whisper. The wind would change direction, blowing down the chimney and puffing smoke into the room, a sudden reminder of the storm outside. They would cover their mouths and wait for the air to clear, the coughing starting again. The nights were the longest part of the existence, stretching out for what seemed like days. They would go to bed early to save candles and wood, huddling together under the skins. The sleep was not continuous, but broken by the cold, by the need to turn over, by the sounds of the house. They would wake in the pitch black, unable to see a hand in front of the face, and listen to the breathing of the others, a reassurance that they were not alone in the void. They would think of the spring, of the green grass and the warm sun, but it felt like a dream, a fantasy that belonged to another world. The reality was this darkness, this cold, this hard bed. They would drift back into sleep, the dreams vivid and strange, fueled by the heavy food and the stale air. Morning would come slowly, a lightening of the gray at the window, a reluctant return to consciousness. The fire would be dead, a pile of cold ash, and the process of starting it again would begin, the striking of the flint, the nursing of the spark, the coaxing of the flame. It was the first victory of the day, a small triumph against the cold. They would break the ice on the water bucket, the surface cracking into shards that floated in the dark liquid. The water was so cold it made the teeth ache. They would wash their faces quickly, the shock of the cold waking them fully. The day would unfold exactly like the one before, a mirror image of boredom and routine. They would check the animals, the breath of the oxen misting in the stable, their large eyes dark and patient. The animals were losing weight, their ribs beginning to show, but they were alive, and that was enough. The chickens were silent, huddled together on the roost, laying no eggs in the dark days. The silence of the barn was different from the silence of the house. It was the silence of waiting, of endurance. The peasant would stroke the flank of the ox, feeling the warmth of the animal, a connection between two living things in a dead world. He would fork some hay into the manger, the dry stalks rustling, the smell of summer grass a faint memory. He would check the roof of the barn, looking for leaks, for the weight of the snow could crush the old timbers.
He would shovel a path to the dung heap, the snow piling up on either side of him, a white canyon. The physical exertion was good. It warmed the blood and cleared the head. He would stop and look out over the fields, a flat white expanse that stretched to the horizon, unbroken by any footprint. The woods in the distance were a dark smudge against the sky. It was a landscape of desolation, beautiful in its severity, but deadly. He would return to the house, shaking the snow from his boots, grateful for the warmth that greeted him. The women would be baking bread, flat loaves on the hot stones of the hearth, the smell of the baking dough filling the room and making the mouth water. It was a simple food, flour and water and a little salt, but it was the staff of life. They would eat it warm, tearing off chunks, the crust hard and the inside soft. It was the highlight of the day, a moment of sensory pleasure in a monotonous existence. They would tell riddles to pass the time, old riddles that everyone knew the answer to, but they laughed anyway, a low chuckle that broke the quiet. The laughter was a defense against the gloom, a spark of humanity in the cold. The afternoon would drag on, the light fading almost as soon as it had arrived. They would do small repairs, fixing a broken stool, patching a hole in a tunic, sharpening a knife. The work was slow and meticulous. There was no rush, no deadline. The only deadline was the spring. They would watch the spider in the corner, spinning its web, a fragile structure of silk that seemed impossible in this heavy world. They would watch the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window, a tiny universe of motion. The boredom was a heavy cloak, weighing down the shoulders, slowing the thoughts. It was a boredom that emptied the mind, leaving it blank and smooth as the snow outside. There was no news from the outside world, no travelers, no messengers. The village was cut off, an island in time. They were forgotten by the king, by the bishop, by the world. And in that forgetting, there was a kind of freedom. No taxes to pay, no wars to fight, no orders to obey. Only the orders of the winter. Keep warm, eat, sleep, wait. The cycle was absolute. The sun set, the darkness fell, the fire glowed, the family slept. And the snow continued to fall, flake by flake, adding to the blanket that covered the world, a soft, white, endless sleep that seemed as if it would last forever, burying the house, the village, and the memory of the sun under a mountain of silence.
The heavy silence of the snow-covered world pressed against the wooden shutters, a physical weight that seemed to dampen even the thoughts in their heads, making every movement slow and deliberate, as if they were moving through honey. The fire in the hearth had settled into a bed of glowing red coals, pulsing with a faint heat that barely reached the corners of the room, where the frost had begun to form intricate fern-like patterns on the inside of the walls. It was a time of suspended animation, a long pause in the frantic sentence of the year, where the only punctuation was the crackle of a dry twig or the soft thud of a shifting log. The peasant sat on a three-legged stool, the wood polished smooth by generations of trousers, and focused his entire attention on the repair of a leather strap, the owl piercing the tough hide with a squeak that sounded loud in the quiet room. He would thread the waxed linen cord through the hole, pulling it tight with a grunt of satisfaction, the repetition of the task a balm to his mind. Beside him, the women were sorting the dried herbs that hung in bunches from the rafters, sage and thyme and rosemary, crumbling the brittle leaves into small piles, the scent of summer releasing into the smoky air, a ghostly reminder of green fields and warm sun. The dust from the herbs danced in the shaft of light that pierced through a crack in the shutter, swirling in slow hypnotic circles. They would check the salted fish in the barrel, lifting the heavy lid to reveal the layers of herring packed in brine, the smell sharp and oceanic, a stark contrast to the wood smoke and wool. They would count the fish again, moving their lips silently, ensuring that the tally matched the days remaining until Lent, a calculation that was performed daily with a mix of anxiety and reassurance. The cold was a constant companion, a presence that sat with them at the table and lay with them in the bed, numbing the fingers and toes until they felt like foreign objects. They would warm stones in the fire, wrapping them in rags to place at their feet, the heat seeping slowly into the flesh, a small luxury that brought a sigh of relief. The dog lay curled in a tight ball, nose tucked under its tail, conserving every spark of warmth, its breathing shallow and even. The cat sat on the highest shelf, a dark shape against the gloom, watching the room with yellow eyes that blinked slowly, the embodiment of patience. Outside, the wind would moan around the eaves, a mournful sound that rose and fell like a distant voice, searching for a way in. They would look at the door, barred and bolstered with a heavy sack of straw, and feel a deep sense of gratitude for the barrier that separated them from the white death outside. The afternoon would wear on, the light shifting from the pale white of noon to the blue-gray of early evening, the shadows stretching across the floor like long fingers. They would eat again, a simple meal of roasted root vegetables, the parsnips sweet and caramelized from the fire, the turnips earthy and solid. They would chew slowly, savoring the texture and the heat, making the meal last as long as possible. There was no conversation, for there was nothing new to say, the topics of the village and the harvest having been exhausted weeks ago. Instead, there was a comfortable silence, a shared understanding of the weight. The grandmother would hum a tune, a low, tuneless melody that had no words, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The children would listen, their eyes heavy, the rhythm lulling them into a stupor. They would watch the smoke rise, twisting and turning as it sought the escape of the vent, disappearing into the cold night air. The walls of the house were thick, made of cob and stone, a fortress against the elements, but they still felt the chill radiating from them, a cold that seemed to seep from the very ground. They would pull their cloaks tighter, wrapping the wool around their shoulders, creating a cocoon of personal warmth. The evening tasks were few, checking the latch on the door, covering the embers with a layer of ash to keep the heart of the fire alive until morning, a ritual that was as sacred as prayer. The darkness would descend completely, a black velvet curtain that blotted out the world, leaving only the small circle of the firelight. They would prepare for sleep, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do, and to sleep was to escape the cold and the hunger. They would lie on the straw mattresses, the rustling of the stalks the only sound, the smell of the dry grass a comfort. They would huddle together, a tangle of limbs and bodies, sharing the heat of life. The breath of the family would create a small cloud above the bed, a mist that hung in the freezing air. They would listen to the wind, the sound muffling the beat of their own hearts.
They would think of the seeds lying dormant in the frozen ground, waiting for the signal to wake, and they would feel a kinship with the earth, a shared state of hibernation. The sleep would come slowly, a drifting away of consciousness, a softening of the edges of reality. The dreams would be simple, of warmth and food and light, the desires of the body manifesting in the mind. The night would be long and silent, the moon casting a pale light on the snow, the world held in a grip of ice. They would wake in the darkness to turn over, to pull the blanket up, to listen for the breathing of the others, and then drift back into the void. The morning would come as a gray dawn, a reluctant lightening of the sky that brought no heat, only visibility. The cycle would begin again, the rekindling of the fire, the breaking of the ice, the slow movements of the day. They would endure, patience their only weapon, boredom their only shield. The winter was a siege, and they were the garrison, holding the fort of life against the army of the cold. The days were indistinguishable, one merging into the next, a continuous loop of survival. They would mend a basket, weaving the willow wands with stiff fingers. They would grind a handful of oats, the stone quern turning with a gritty sound. They would stare into the fire, seeing faces in the flames, losing themselves in the dance of the orange and blue. The mind would empty of thought, becoming a vessel of the silence. The boredom was not a burden, but a state of being, a necessary pause. The heart beat slow, the breath was steady. The world was white, the house was warm, the wait was long, the sleep was deep, the life was simple, and the winter went on and on and on, a vast, white, silent ocean of time.
The deep midwinter settled over the land like a heavy stone, the days becoming indistinguishable from one another, a blur of gray light and long nights that seemed to stretch into eternity. The snow had ceased to fall, but the wind had picked up, scouring the fields and piling the drifts against the walls of the house until the windows were half buried in white. Inside, the air was still and thick, with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, a scent of hibernation that was warm and familiar. The peasant would sit by the fire, his hands idle for once, watching the flames lick at the bottom of the iron pot, the water bubbling with a low, steady sound that was the heartbeat of the room. He would think of the forest, the trees standing silent and bare, their branches locked in ice, waiting for the sap to rise, a mirror of his own waiting. The women would be mending the linen shifts, the needle flashing in the firelight, the thread pulling through the fabric with a soft hiss. They would work in silence, the only sound the snap of the fire and the occasional shift of a log settling into the ash. The children were quiet, their energy spent, lying on the sheepskins and staring at the roof, tracing the patterns of the thatch with their eyes. The cold was a physical presence, a guest that would not leave, sitting in the corners and creeping across the floor. They would wrap their feet in rags, binding them tight to keep the warmth in, the sensation of the rough cloth a comfort. The food was simple and repetitive, a pottage of dried peas and barley that sat heavy in the stomach, providing the fuel to keep the body warm. They would eat slowly, scraping the wooden bowls clean, savoring the heat of the food more than the taste. The dog would watch them, its eyes following the spoon, a silent plea for a scrap that rarely came. The cat would be asleep in the warmest spot, a ball of fur that rose and fell with its breathing. The light from the fire would cast long shadows that danced on the walls, creating shapes that looked like giants or monsters, but the family was too tired to be afraid. They would listen to the wind howling down the chimney, a sound that was lonely and wild, reminding them of the emptiness of the world outside. The village was a ghost town. No one moved in the streets. No smoke rose from the forge. The silence was absolute. They would check the stores again, counting the onions and the apples, the fear of running out a dull ache in the back of the mind. They would touch the salt pork, the surface hard and cold, calculating how thin they could slice it to make it last. The water in the bucket would freeze overnight, a thick crust of ice that had to be broken with a heavy ladle, the sound of the cracking ice sharp and loud in the morning quiet. They would melt snow for washing, the water cold and soft on the skin. The days were short, the sun a pale disk that barely cleared the trees before sinking back into the earth, leaving behind a long blue twilight. They would go to bed early to save the candles, the darkness a blanket that covered them and held them close. They would lie awake and listen to the house settling, the timbers creaking as the temperature dropped, the thatch rustling in the wind. They would think of the spring, of the green shoots pushing through the mud, of the birds singing in the trees, but it felt like a dream, a memory of a different life. The winter was the only reality, a world of white and gray and cold. They would drift into sleep, a heavy, dreamless slumber that was a retreat from the world. The morning would come with a reluctance, the light seeping into the room like a gray stain. They would wake and start the fire again, the routine a comfort, a structure in the formless days. They would check the animals in the barn, the cows chewing their cud with a slow, rhythmic motion, their breath misting in the cold air. The barn was warmer than the house, the heat of the animals trapped in the straw and the wood. They would lean against the flank of a cow, borrowing its warmth, feeling the slow beat of its heart. The smell of the manure and the hay was strong and pungent, a smell of life in the dead of winter. They would fork down some hay, the dust dancing in the shaft of light from the door. They would check the sheep, their wool thick and greasy, protecting them from the cold. The animals were patient, accepting the winter with a stoicism that the humans tried to emulate. They would return to the house, the wind biting at their faces, the snow crunching under their boots. The path was narrow and slippery, a trench cut through the drifts. They would stomp the snow off their feet at the door, the sound echoing in the small room. The day would pass in a blur of small tasks, mending a net, sharpening a tool, grinding grain. The quernstone would turn with a heavy grinding sound, the flour falling into the bowl in a soft white mound. They would mix the flour with water and salt to make bannocks, cooking them on the hot stones of the hearth, the smell of the baking bread filling the room and making the mouth water. It was a simple pleasure, a moment of warmth and fullness. They would sit and watch the fire, the flames mesmerizing, the heat lulling them into a trance. The mind would wander, thinking of nothing, just existing in the moment. The boredom was a blanket, soft and heavy, wrapping them in a cocoon of safety. There was no need to think, no need to plan, only to be. The world outside could howl and storm, but inside the house, life went on, slow and steady. The darkness would come again, closing in around the house, pushing against the windows. They would light a rushlight, the weak flame sputtering and smoking, giving off a faint light that barely reached the corners of the room. They would tell stories in the dark, old tales of heroes and magic, their voices low and soft. The stories were a way to pass the time, to keep the darkness at bay. They would listen to the wind howling, imagining it was the voice of spirits or ancestors. They would feel a connection to the past, to all the people who had sat by fires in the winter and waited for the spring. The continuity of life was a comfort, a thread that connected them to the earth and to each other. They would sleep again, the cycle of day and night blurring into one long wait. The snow would deepen, covering the fences and the bushes, turning the world into a blank page. The birds would be silent, hiding in the thickets, waiting for the thaw. The foxes would be hungry, prowling the edges of the village, their tracks a line of dots in the snow. The wolves would be howling in the distance, a sound that sent a shiver down the spine. But the house was strong, the door was barred, the fire was warm.
They were safe in their burrow, hidden from the world. The winter was a test, a trial of endurance, but they were strong, they were patient, they would wait it out, day by day, hour by hour. The sun would return, the snow would melt, the green would come back. But for now, there was only the white, the cold, the silence, the waiting, the breathing, the sleeping, the slow, steady rhythm of the medieval winter. The fire popped, a spark landing on the hearthstone and fading to gray ash. The log shifted, the wind sighed, the world turned, and the sleep continued, deep and heavy and full of peace. The wool was scratchy against the skin, but it held the heat. The straw mattress rustled with every movement. The smell of the onions in the loft was faint and earthy. The darkness was total. The silence was loud. The peace was absolute. They were the keepers of the flame, the watchers in the night, the sleepers in the snow. And they would wait and wait and wait until the world woke up again.